transgender people. She came back and she risked her life to be able to come back. And now she faces what we call the 10-year ban because she had been deported before. So she's still out there. She's trying to make ends meet. She is still a contributor. The reality she faces hasn't changed, and there's no laws, there is no remedies for her, no humanitarian relief for her, and she will be also one of the folks that could be targeted. And the other one, she's the one that is going deeper into the shadows. This is a recent case that I heard over in some community forums that we had in South Minneapolis. This is a mother of two under 10 years old kids. She has been a victim of domestic abuse for some time. She says that her mate hasn't been physical with her in front of her kids, that she believes he's a good father. But she also knows that that's not a way for her to live. But now she's scared to even come to the authorities because she knows that if she puts out a request for law enforcement involvement, her kid's parent could potentially be streamlined to deportation. This story came to my attention less than a month ago. So this is a woman that is living in a dangerous situation and that now has to decide what's going to be less dangerous for her and for her family. So these are in not so much legal framework, the blueprint of what we call mass deportation. It's people convicted of any criminal offense, regardless of what the offense was, when it occurred, or the circumstances of conviction. People who haven't even been convicted of a crime but have been charged with one. People who have broken a law or are suspects with no charges of convictions resulting. People with final administrative deportation orders, no matter how long ago they received the orders and their positive ties and contributions. And anyone else under ICE officer authority and discretion. This is a quote from James Baldwin. We live in an age in which silence is not only criminal but suicidal. For if they take you in the morning, they will be coming for us that night. We had some community forums and action items. These forums started before the executive orders passed. So we've been having a conversation with folks about their fears and the possible outcomes if there were some orders, if some promises that were made during campaign were actually become a reality. And we heard both from allies and people affected. And these are some of their ideas. Basically, we believe that if we are to have a safe Minneapolis, where we all live in a secure city and a trusted city, we need to have some kind of decriminalization to interrupt removals, safe public buildings and facilities where people cannot be taken out for showing up to their court hearings or coming to the municipality to get some support for their families and then been taken away in the line. Protected information and data, what kind of data is shared with federal authorities, and just know that the ICE officer's discretion is wide and broad, and they don't have an accountability body, so they are able to act on their own discretion to pursue removals of many different kinds. Also, secure municipal ID. What I mean with security is who is going to have access to that database. We heard that in Chicago they have a municipal ID, but also after a few months with the information reaching to federal authorities, they were also seeing that this database was also used to remove people. And then the next one, I'm not sure if it's a city jurisdiction, but it's to allow homeowners to declare homestead and property protection in case of ceasing. So this is nothing that has come out in the media. There is no executive order for that. But a lot of the energy that is happening, the prosecution that is about to, we believe that is about to happen, reminds people of hard times when they had to protect their property and their savings, their bank accounts. And that's where the ceasing part comes from. What's going to happen with, for example, my house, if they know that I'm undocumented and I cannot do a fast sale right away? What's going to happen with my savings accounts? What's going to happen with the money that I'm trying to wire that is a lifeline for my family? Then another one is to accept your visa as a mandatory municipal program, and this is for victims of violent crimes. This is a pathway actually for an immigration remedy and eventually a citizenship. And also special attention to hate crimes. What we're seeing is an increment of interpersonal racial exchanges in schools, in the streets, and we don't have at the moment anybody else to rely on but ourselves and how our community is going to respond. But also, what type of protection is the city and is the city going to provide for people to be criminalized? Because like when are we going to draw the line and hope that this doesn't end up in a hurtful exchange? We also talked about investment, the creation of an emergency defense fund that will provide some legal support for people in removal proceedings. And then investment for civic engagement and leadership development of communities under attack. I think that we all know that the affected communities are the ones that know the best answer and the best solution for our problems. And then investment in naturalization of folks that have a pathway to citizenship. That's the safest way to keep people outside of deportation proceedings and that can fulfill their fully constitutional rights. And then we're looking at the bigger picture, how the council members are going to support us in leveraging the message to the county and the state so that they can provide some measures in case of that your jurisdiction is limited. How can we partner in that? Sorry, I got distracted with my baby crying. How can we partner in making sure that there's a conversation that is going to be broader than the city limits? And we also hope that with your influence and leadership, we can provide some guidance for the other municipalities through the League of Cities. And also having a broader conversation about what we call the racial gaps. When you have kids that are afraid to open their doors, not wanting to show up to school because they don't know if their parents are going to come and pick them up after school or from the bus stop. When you have families saving money in case of removal, selling things, when you have people being afraid to be on the road, that is not an equation for prosperity for the city or the state. So we know that immigrant rights are part of the solution to close the gap in the city and the region. So this is all what I have for you. And I know that the testimonies and the stories that I share will never do justice for the people that I asked for permission to share some of their stories with you. But they all live in Minneapolis. Some of you are your constituents. And so hopefully we can provide some imagination. During the latest forum, we started talking about magic. What is the magic that we can do to protect our families? And that's because we see all this threat about removing federal funding, about limiting our jurisdiction, about using our powers. But then what have we learned through history and through our resistance through the years about being innovative and resilient when we are under attack and our brothers and sisters are suffering and we're not taking action. So thank you so much. That's all that I have.
So I wanted to say thank you, thank you so very, very much for being here with us, for sharing those stories on behalf of others who gave you permission to be able to make sure that we're getting that also into the general public sphere. But also thank you for the recommendations that have come from community on ideas, and we will be having at the end of this meeting a staff direction about how to take the ideas that we are hearing both from our staff and from community and evaluate them and then take some action. So I just want to say thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to introduce some people who have joined us. We have Councilmember Warsami on the committee. We've also been joined by Councilmembers Reich and Gordon. Our mayor, Betsy Hodges, is with us today. And we also are joined by two of our state representatives. Representative Ray Dean is here, and I've lost him, but he's here. And Representative Ilhan Omar is here, and we were going to, I think, hope to hear from her before she has to leave this meeting. And then we also have been joined by two staff members from Congressman Ellison's office, Mitra Nelson and Nikki Leingang, and so I want to thank them as well for joining us. If I've missed anyone, I apologize. I think because I know some folks may have to leave, that we might continue to maybe take some more information about the community perspective and then turn to the legal piece, because I think that might take a little bit longer. And I understand Representative Omar, who was going to share some comments, might have to leave soon. So by 11, okay. So maybe we will go ahead. I'm just going to ask her right now because she's sitting right here. So would it be all right if we took one of our legal presentations first then? And I think that will work. Okay, so what we had planned to do next then is have Mr. John Keller come, and he is with the Immigration Law Center of Minnesota. And I want to thank him so much for being here, because he has been, I think, almost everywhere in the community answering questions, being a legal resource and expert, giving advice on cases, working on cases. So thank you very much for being here, Mr. Keller.
My pleasure. Members of the committee and the council, Mayor, it's my honor to share some of both the legal perspective on the executive orders, as well as some of the impact that those orders have had on our practice, on the communities, on the state of the law over the last 2 weeks. I'm the executive director at the Immigrant Law Center. Just for background, for those who aren't familiar with the organization, we're the state's largest provider of free legal services to low-income immigrants and refugees who come from all over the world. Our data from 2015, we had clients from 104 countries who lived in 85% of Minnesota's counties. We have 5 offices, 2 in the metro, 1 in Worthington, 1 in Moorhead, and 1 recently opened in Austin. We work on federal legal immigration matters, primarily with individuals and families, but also work on public policy as well as education. I want to thank you for having this conversation today. It is extremely timely. I want to just highlight something that Attorney Segal raised as well, and that's the importance of U visas. Our office, about 25% of our work annually is working with victims of crime who have the courage to come forward to seek protection with local law enforcement, to protect themselves. If it's an adult victim, oftentimes it's to protect their children. The U visa is a statutory piece of law, and it depends on community members being able to trust local law enforcement. I'm proud to say that our work with Minneapolis Police Department, with the County Attorney's Office, is some of our most cooperative, understanding partners in terms of the idea of community policing, of making all communities safe through the U visa. And so we thank you for that and underscore, I think, the importance of U visas when we talk about the January 25th executive order. I'm going to first start with the January 27th executive order. It's come to be known as the refugee ban, although it's much broader than that. I'm going to go through the top 7 ways in which it's impacting the country, our state, and the city. So the importance, I think, is to make sure that people understand that this is broader than what we have commonly been hearing about, which is people being prevented from coming into our country. While that's certainly important and very dramatic, the other additional points are worth underscoring in this opportunity. Forgot to start my watch, so I'll try to speed up. First and foremost, all refugees from all over the country are banned under the January 27th order for 4 months, period. It's not just a ban on Muslim refugees. So many of our Karen refugees who we work with, we have 2 Karen paralegal who work both here in the Metro and in Worthington, have also equally been impacted. The Karen refugees, if you don't know, are the folks that the U.S. is resettling are 95% Christian, worth noting. And it's also worth comparing that the action to ban refugees for 4 months exceeds what we undertook after 9/11. So we've, in terms of comparison to the reaction post 9/11, we slowed down refugee processing and stopped it for 90 days. And this exceeds that reaction. Number 2, it cuts by 55% the total number of refugees the U.S. Will receive. So beginning last fall, the Obama administration committed to 110,000 of the most vulnerable individuals from all over the world to be resettled in the United States. Under the executive order, that will be reduced by 55%. That means 60,000 individuals who were in the queue, who were preparing, oftentimes selling their possessions in very dangerous and desperate refugee camps, will not come. It's also worth noting that the temporary restraining order does not affect that 55% reduction in numbers. All Syrian refugees, indefinitely banned. Persons with valid visas, whether they be immigrant visas or non-immigrant visas from the 7 named countries, had their visas canceled. People stuck outside of the United States. It suspends what is a mainstay of immigration law, which is the visa interview waiver program for elderly persons, for children, for people who have returning visas, who work in our businesses, in our hospitals, in our universities, sending them all back in to be interviewed in a very slow and cumbersome foreign consular interview process. Number 6, it requires the creation of new screening questions, which I think is one of the more troubling aspects of the executive order. There is no basis in immigration law for these new questions. They are highly subjective standards, basically seeking to create criteria to make sure any new entry or any person seeking immigration benefit will be a productive member of society. And finally, it seeks to undo important waivers that have been created for the material support to terrorism bar that came out of 9/11. It's worth underscoring the level of vetting that refugees go through, because there's been a fair amount of misinformation because of this executive order. It's as though we weren't vetting prior to this. If you speak to any of the refugee resettlement agencies, International Institute just a couple nights ago told me that the average wait time is now approaching 20 years in refugee camps. Before anyone's allowed to resettle, they must go through vetting and processing through the U.S. Counterterrorism Center, the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the State Department. So that's the highlights, if you will, of the January 27th executive order. As you know, the Minnesota Attorney General took the unprecedented step of filing a lawsuit, of joining the state of Washington to enjoin the executive order. It was the fifth court, the court in Washington, the fifth federal court that entertained legal action. All five of the courts, their initial emergency reactions were to enjoin different parts of the order. Minnesota's Attorney General and the Washington Attorney General have had the most expansive enjoining of the executive order. And she undertook it on behalf of 30,000 Minnesota residents who come from those 7 countries. I think people who work with the Somali community alone know that that number is probably quite a bit higher than 30,000. It also was undertaken, if you look at their brief, on behalf of the University of Minnesota and McAllister by name, because of both international professors, international students, and the general student body who are affected by this. It was undertaken on behalf of Minnesota corporations and the Mayo Clinic. And it was undertaken on behalf of one of our clients, 4-year-old Mushkad, who was separated from her mother, scheduled to come to the U.S. after almost 4 years in a refugee camp, who was prevented from coming just days before she was supposed to get on a flight. It's important to know she is here, and we're very grateful to the Attorney General for helping to lift the order to allow her to be reunified with her mother. The constitutionality, I'll try to go briefly through the constitutional claims. I was asked to cover that as well, of the Washington order. Again, in the filing, I'll just tick off the causes of action under the Constitution. The first is the Establishment Clause, which, if you're not familiar with it, prohibits the federal government from officially preferring one religion over another. The second cause of action that I'll name is due process. The Fifth Amendment of the Constitution prohibits the federal government from depriving individuals of their liberty interests without due process of law. The fourth is in the Immigration and Naturalization Act, which prohibits discrimination in the allocation of visas. The fifth is the denial of international protections, which I think the advocates for human rights will address. You are, under international requirements, required to provide asylum and withholding and protection against torture screening for anybody who fears persecution upon return. And finally, the violation of the Administrative Procedures Act. You can't take away a person's substantive rights without notice, without engaging in all stakeholders' ability to address that. The nature of the executive action and the Washington court's enjoining of the executive action underscores the challenge that we as legal professionals have in helping to educate the community about what is the state of the law, what could happen, and what actions they should or should not be taking. I think the most telling example I can give of this real-life impact, on Friday night, I was speaking at a mosque in South Minneapolis. I was asked to cover what is the impact of the executive order, particularly on Minneapolis's Muslim community. as I was walking in, it was a 6 p.m. appointment, I heard come over the wire the news that the TRO had been granted in Washington. So I stepped back and tried to review what exactly was changed because of it. And when I announced that it had happened, I think I was expecting people to be more excited or relieved. And the reality was, in my assessment, people were just more confused about this very fluid, ever-changing impact on their lives and their family members' lives. And I've said this a number of times, I've never had to condition my remarks. As an attorney, people want us to tell them what can they rely on, what does the law say, and with every presentation I've given really since the election, we've had to say, this is our best advice, this is what we know as of the day that we're giving it today. It's subject to interpretation, to change, and please stay tuned. That is not a way in which we can carry out our immigration policy. The second executive order, which city's attorney has already addressed in some parts, I also want to address some of the pieces of it that are particularly worthy of challenging, in my opinion. First and foremost, the January 25th executive order entitled Enhancing Public Safety in the Interior of the United States terminated President Obama's November 2014 deportation priorities. This is important. It's extremely important in our practice. What the previous priorities laid out was the recognition that the federal government has limited enforcement dollars, and that those limited enforcement dollars would be applied to persons that put the country at most risk. So persons who represented a risk to our public safety, for example, people with convictions for felonies. What it's been replaced with by the January 25th memo is a series of conditions within the circles of immigration attorneys. The challenge has been to us, in sort of a gallows humor moment, is there anyone who's undocumented today in the United States who we could conceive of that is not included in the quote-unquote priorities? In other words, there are no priorities because every possible undocumented person is subsumed in Section 5 of that executive order. To give you 3 examples, if you've been charged with a criminal offense, even if that charge has not been resolved or has been dropped, you can now be targeted. Even less definable, if you've committed acts that constitute a possible charge for a crime, you can be targeted. And lastly, and there's more to it, but I'm just highlighting the 3 that trouble us the most as lawyers and officers of the court. In the judgment of an immigration officer, if you pose a risk to public safety or national security, you can be denied entry or denied benefit. No review, no procedures in the judgment of an immigration officer. Keep in mind that the Office of Inspector General has delivered a scathing report analyzing Customs and Border Protections for their existing lack of accountability and abuse. Also in the January 25th executive order, and I'm going to wrap up, 10,000 new ICE agents, 5,000 new Border Patrol agents. And finally, I think the piece that impacts Minnesota and Minneapolis and other jurisdictions that also has not received a lot of attention, the reinstatement of what's referred to as 287G. It refers to a section of the Immigration and Naturalization Act. It's basically the ability for a state, a municipality, a county to engage in an agreement with Homeland Security to take on, as part of their enforcement duties, the enforcement of immigration law, civil immigration law. With that, just going to check my notes to make sure I didn't forget anything. I do think it bears stating that the executive orders that have been released already are also part of what have been leaked in terms of additional potential executive orders. This is not a circumstance or a situation where I feel we've seen everything that this president is contemplating. So I think for organizations like ours and for the city, not only reacting to what's happened, but also preparing for what additional actions may be taken is essential. And the last thing I would say is I applaud you. I thank you for your leadership. I thank the mayor for being a voice from the very beginning for all persons of Minneapolis and Minnesota. And I encourage you as I speak to elected officials, to community groups, to faith communities, to business groups, to keep in mind that all of us, I think, need to be as strategic as we can in inviting not just action and defense from our positions of power and our positions of leverage, but to reach out across the metro, across the state. This has to be a response on behalf of Minnesotans' constitutional rights, due process rights, as well as the best interests of the state. So for us, that means working even more closely with all of the partners that we've worked with for years, and I encourage you all to do the same. I'm happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Keller, for all of your work and for your comments to us and recommendations to us.